so Gŵyl Haf. Welcome everybody and welcome back to another day at Gŵyl Haf. I hope you've all been having a lovely day so far. With me today I have the writer and translator Lawrence Schimel. Thank you so much, Lawrence, for joining me.
A pleasure.
Lawrence, you may have seen has already made an appearance at the festival, but I brought him back and tying him in to focus on kids' books, and in particular Lawrence has written a lot of very inclusive kids' books that are sort of inclusive of sexuality, gender, race, disability, and you know, what don't we like about that? And obviously they're in translation, and Lawrence writes in both Spanish and English. So where I wanted to begin is, how did you come to writing kids books, and what was it? Was it always a goal of yours, or was it sort of unintentional?
Okay, so I'm speaking to everyone from Madrid right now in Spain, where I've lived for the past 20-something years. I'm originally from New York City, and one of the things I did, I've always loved kids' books, and I used to work at a children's bookstore in New York, Books of Wonder, before I left the country. So kids' books has definitely been on my radar for a long time. I do also write for adults. You know, between the kids' books and the adult books, I have over 120 books that I've either written or edited as anthologist. So that's a lot. The kids' books have a particular place in my heart. And I think also that kids are much more appreciative readers. So as long as you don't talk down to children, then and you give them a good story. So I mean, you know, you mentioned that I do a lot of books that are, you know, considered inclusive or diverse, but I think that the world we live in is inclusive and diverse, and we need to reflect that for the kids rather than a lot of the sort of whitewashing or gatekeeping or things like that that happen, or voices that are suppressed actively or passively. So, you know, I think that you know, my goal generally is to take those or to see what's not being represented and to include that as an integral part of a story, but not necessarily be only the focus of the story.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's sort of what is has been missing in the past. That sort of, if that was a part of the story, it had to be the focal of the story, whereas it is obviously not how we all live our lives. We all actually.
I think that, you know, I mean, so much, there's so much power or questions of power that come into play in publishing and in translation also, of who's being translated, who isn't being translated. But in terms of, you know, basically the stories that center the people with power are the ones that tend to be seen as universal and worthy of being published, as opposed to anything that challenges the status quo. So it's always much easier to have a, you know, white cis heteronormative characters within the Anglophone world that we're speaking in right now. I mean, the same is also true for Spanish, which is the other language that I create in, and I do translate in both directions, especially kids' books and poetry. And so, you know, those power decisions come into play so much on a publishing level and even on a writing level. I think that very often, even when writing about certain experiences or identities, even if they're own voices, very often they're writing from the periphery to the center, as opposed to writing from their experience, you know, to an audience that is an audience of their own peers. And so that's definitely something. I definitely know that as a translator, and especially when I'm translating Spanish into English for the Anglophone market, and especially with Latin American kids' books, that many Anglophone editors demand or expect that the book perform its Latinidad. That is, that the books, you can't just have a good book. It has to be a good book about Latinness in order for editors interested in translating this particular book from this particular country.
So could you talk a little bit more about like the importance of visibility in that sense, where it's not just about sort of, you know, if it's a book from a Latin like Mexico, it's not just about being Mexican, it's just some normal people living in Mexico. And sort of that applies visibility wise. I think it's sort of is the wider debate. Well, there is no debate, but it's the wider, sort of what the, publishing industry or people in the publishing industry are trying to change in kids' books, is that visibility. And sort of for the people in the back who maybe have not heard about this before, what's going on?
So, but I think also that, visibility is important, but it's not the only goal, I think. And so, and there's many things that are at play of who has access to telling their stories and to being published, to finding a platform as it is, or to making their own platforms if they're being denied platforms by the overall corporate publishing thing. I've published a lot of books. Very often my books are being published more often with independent publishers rather than corporate publishers. I have published with corporate publishers as well. Very often those books are, I remember years ago being shocked that, I was published by a large publishing house in New York that publishes around 600 books a year. And I learned that, they had 3 publicists for 600 books. I got 2 days of a publicist's attention. That was it. And I don't think I got a full 2 days, because you have the bestsellers who get, extra attention. And so they took, half of a day of my of my 2 days worth of publicist attention. And that's just the reality of, the big corporate publishers. At the same time, a small publisher that maybe does 12 books a year, every book is, vitally important to their list and to their catalog. And very often they're publishing not just to throw them out in the world and see what sticks, but also that they're publishing sort of long term, if that makes sense. So there are some books I have with small independent publishers, but that they'll backlist and still be selling 1,000 copies a year, even 10 years after publication, and that's something that this is something very different with children's books than with the adult world, where every few years you have a new audience, so that the audience renews itself. And so as long as a book is in print, it can still continue to find new readers much more easily, I think, than adult books. There's so many adult books that are published that just the avalanche of new titles at bookstores just bumps your book off of the new release table, and that it's very hard to get bookstores to reorder, aside from the independents that will fall in love with books and support books and authors and things like that. But just at the chains, it's just so, the churn is just so constant that it's very difficult to. One thing I'll mention, you did mention that I have some books about sexuality. So even these are 2 board books I have. These are the ones that'll be coming out in Welsh later in September, translated by Mary Sion and Ellen Haf into Welsh. There's also an English edition that'll be coming out in the UK, which is interesting because it's a self-translation, a rhyming self-translation, and the books are also coming out in English in Canada and in New Zealand. And all of the English translations, even though they're all my self-translation, are very different. So the Welsh translation, for instance, this book, for instance, is about a boy and a cat. He wakes up early and the cat's the only one who's awake. His 2 moms and his sister are still asleep. So in the Welsh English version, it says ma'am instead of mum or mom. And so, little differences. This one is about a girl who's trying to go to bed and her dog wants to play, and she just happens to have 2 dads, and the dog gets jealous and steals her bear. Hijinks ensue. So in this one, whether it's a teddy bear, whether it's a stuffy, there's all these regional things. What I was going to say, though, is that sometimes they're published by traditional publishers. Sometimes they're published, for instance, these were published in Switzerland by a NGO that supports rainbow families. And so, there's lots of, that's the German one. Actually, I love, just to say, so the Spanish title is No es hora de jugar, so it's not time to play. And I think in English, it's being called Bedtime, Not Playtime. But the German title, Hundemüde, is dog tired. And I just think that's wonderful. I want to change the original
Yes, that's so good. Oh, I love that. Yeah, it is bedtime. Oh, love it. So obviously something that's very apparent there and just you showing those. And these 4 books have been translated into like 30 it was a lot of languages, isn't it?
There's 23 editions, because sometimes, you know, the 3 different English editions are not 3 different languages, but they are 3 different editions. So no, I mean, it's amazing. And it's fascinating that, you know, I mean, these are books that have visibility, have representation, but are not about being lesbian or gay. It just happens to be that these are just families, and these are fun stories that just happen to take place in same-sex families. And so it's amazing for me that that so many different places have been willing to publish the books. The books are coming out, for instance, in Russia, where they had to put 18 plus on the cover, and they may not be able to sell. It's an NGO in Russia that's doing it. Elena and I have donated the rights, and they have lawyers in place to defend them when they publish the book, and to actually defend the printer that's going to print the book, because it's considered propaganda, homosexual propaganda for children. So you're not allowed to do that. And so, you know, technically it's not for kids. And there's still doubt of whether they can sell it. So it may be that you can donate to the NGO and they can give you a book, but they can't sell you a book, possibly. So, and one thing that's interesting is they're doing, instead of 2 separate books, they have the 2 books in 1 volume. So that's an interesting, but you know, the important thing is to get the books out into kids' hands so that they can see that these are loving families. And
absolutely. And something that is sort of, you know, very much brings that to life for kids is obviously the illustration, which is a unique, it shouldn't be, in my opinion, so unique only to young children's books. But at the moment it currently is, more or less, a few notable exceptions. So what is it like working with an illustrator, and do you tend to write first and then reach out to an illustrator? Do you sort of work together at the same time? What's that process like?
so that was something I was actually going to mention about these books and about the different translations. So, I mean, because translation isn't only the text. And so very often, so in this this story, for instance, one of the things I like, there's this little joke. So we go to the kitchen and I prepare bread with margarine. And then the cat prefers margarine without bread. So it's a little joke like that. Now, in a lot of the translations, including in the Swiss editions, they were like, oh, the translation's lovely. The only thing is that we're Swiss, we cannot have margarine. It must be butter. You know, just culturally, it was like, we cannot have margarine. And so in this edition, the artist actually had to go and erase the word margarine from the,
Oh,
which is, the other thing that was fascinating, so it was published in Switzerland in the 4 official languages, which includes Romansh. And so in both of the Romansh books, the translation meant that the art had to be changed. So in all of the other languages, the dog Rex is mentioned on the first page. These are, they're written in rhyme. And so in the Romansh, though, Rex isn't mentioned until the 2nd page. So we had to actually flip the art around for their edition in order for it to make sense, for that the illustrations to match properly. So this is something that happens. Just another example, there's a book of mine that was published in Brazil, illustrated by Tiago Lopes, who's a Brazilian artist. And so this is set in his neighborhood in Sao Paulo. So one of the things it has, this is just a sample, but it has a no parking, and in Portuguese it's no estacionar. And so there's an E. So when the book was published in English under the title, Will You Read My Book With Me? That had to be changed in the art. So it's P for no parking. And also, you know, there's sort of, you can see that the signs were sort of all wiped out, whereas in the original, they all, I think, they're all in Portuguese.
Yes.
And also there's graffiti in Portuguese on the back that was removed for or the English language edition. So that's just, sometimes translation also affects the art sometimes, not just the illustrations. I write first. Sometimes I'm in touch with the illustrator, sometimes I'm not. It's usually the publishers who decide who illustrates a story. Very often, publishers, when they're introducing a new writer, they will use an established illustrator, and vice versa. If they're introducing a new illustrator, they'll use an established writer so that the audience has a hook already of some sort. Translating illustrated books is also very interesting that, one of the things, my philosophy in translating is that you want to recreate the reading experience. So you're going to want to, if something is rhyming and fun and lively and has lots of wordplay, you're going to want to recreate that in the translation, even if the same type of wordplay is not available. So for instance, you might have something that has a lot of alliteration, and you may compensate by putting it in a different line or a different place in the translation, but you try and recreate that. So, but one of the things you can't do in a translation, so if you're translating something that's pure text, you have a lot more freedom. So let's say you had, if I'm translating into Spanish, Crazy Cat, a character named Crazy Cat. So you have that alliteration. The problem is that in Spanish, Crazy Cat is gato loco. So you lose it. So you can either do something like make it loro loco, which would be crazy parrot. But if the art shows a cat, you can't do that. You have to keep a cat. So you have to find you could say gato gordo, which is fat cat, which would be a different way of keeping the alliteration and keeping the cat so that it matches the illustration. So that's something that's an extra tricky thing that we have to keep in mind when translating children's books or illustrated books, including comics for adults as well. So
I imagine the rhyme can sometimes be quite tricky to translate as well.
Rhyme can be tricky. So the reason I wrote these books, in the two board books in part, was I translate a lot in rhyme, and especially rhyming into rhyming Spanish. And so, but I'd never written, even having written 100 books, I hadn't written a rhyming book before. And so, although I guess now that those two little books have 23 different editions, it was a successful decision, I guess, to write in rhyme. So
how do you so you mentioned, and I know that you write in both Spanish and English, and that's not something very many people have ever sort of achieved as writers. What's it like writing in two different languages?
I think differently in the two languages, and and one of the things I love about learning languages is how it changes how you think. So I was in a adult poetry workshop in Slovenia a number of years ago, and I learned that Slovenian has a dual. So even though Spanish and English, which are the languages I create in, don't have this dual, I'm always aware when I'm using we, am I using this intimate you and I we, which is the dual, or am I using a plural three or more we? So that, learning this facet of language is something that makes me see the world in a different way. So, and obviously if I'm writing about Spain in English, I write differently than if I write about it in Spanish. So I could say something like, after school, they had a merienda. So merienda in Spain is a snack you have at like 6 o'clock, whereas in the Anglophone world at 6 o'clock, many people have already had dinner. But since culturally we have lunch in Spain is generally between 2 and 4, and then dinner's after 9 p.m. So, if I'm writing in Spanish, I could just say merienda. I don't have to explain it. Whereas if I'm writing in English about Spain, I have to, I can't take for granted that the audience will understand or know things. So.
Obviously, it's called sometimes, if people don't know, it's sometimes called glossing, that's sort of explaining a little bit more.
That's also something that comes up, I think, in translations, that translations are expected to be glossed or to explain everything in a way that original texts don't. So I remember that, I learned how to read, and I learned a tremendous amount of vocabulary on my own, reading, consulting a dictionary if I had to, or just learning through inference and picking up words there are lots of words that I know what they mean, I know how to use them, and I don't know how to speak them. I can't pronounce them because I've never spoken them. They're words that I've learned. And I think that one thing that's very different, but I mean, I'm turning 50 this year. So the books that I had when I was a kid were bolder in terms of having complex vocabulary words, that they didn't talk down to kids. They didn't tone things down as much as I think the tendency is today, especially with picture books. And this is also something that I've seen a lot, writing in English and writing in Spanish. So the Anglophone world for original picture books doesn't like to have more than like a line or two, maximum 2 sentences on a spread. The Spanish speaking world wants value for money. So they don't want too few words in a book. And so otherwise parents just are like, nope, I'm not paying what a book costs in order to. So that's another obstacle that comes up when I'm, trying to translate from Spanish into English, is that very often books are very text heavy compared to what the Anglophone market thinks a picture book should have. These sort of age questions also happen, I think, with older texts as well. So there are books, these are both books that I translated, one a Mexican bibliofantasy by Juan Villoro, The Wild Book, which is published in the UK by Hope Road, and The Treasure of Barracuda by Llanos Campos, published by Source Books in the US. Both of these were young adult in Mexico or in Spain, and they're both middle grade in the Anglophone world. So they were toned down. I think also that there's other things that may be toned the opposite way, that you can have smoking or things like, or drinking, casual drinking in a middle grade in Spanish language, and it's not a problem, or the amount of cursing that can happen, and those elements would make something age up in the English speaking world.
Yeah. Do you remember, sort of, you mentioned that sort of literature has changed somewhat since you were a child. Do you remember the first time you saw like queer representation in a kid's book at all? Or were there any sort of books that you remember from your own childhood? Obviously, I'm sure there are, but that were maybe sort of informative in how you now approach writing children's books.
So I think that of the books from my growing up, the closest things would be the Frog and Toad books, which weren't, I probably didn't read them as queer at that age, but that definitely read queer as an adult. So, and I think that, I don't know, I mean, there's, representation goes through these levels, and I think that the first level is always going to be this, the problem novel, or the problem, the subject is the only plot motive for the book. My uncle is gay, or my aunt is HIV positive, or whatever it's going to be. The second level is when that element of diversity is integrated into the plot, but it's still a major plot point, as opposed to something like these books where the same-sex families is not at all about the plot. I mean, these are just fun books about kids and their pets and their families. A recent book I wrote in Spanish, Que Suerte Tengo. This is a book that's very special. It's Que Suerte Tengo is How Lucky I Am. And the main character, he has his best friend, and it's all the things he's jealous about his best friend, so like when he's at the friend's house, they can play with his toy soldiers, and then they can stop and have a merienda and just leave everything where it is. But at his house, everything has to be in place so that his brother doesn't hurt himself. So it never says that the brother's blind, but his brother's blind. And so, his best friend has an iguana. He's desperate to have a pet, any pet, even a miserable little hamster, but he can't have a pet. But his brother gets a guide dog. The mother's always losing her keys, and the brother's the only one who knows where they are. He says, "Mom, I heard you put them down on the kitchen table." So, and this page is very special because it's got Braille.
That's gorgeous. That page is so clever as well. Like, that's just beautiful. Like,
you had asked about the illustration. So this is a Colombian illustrator, Juan Camilo Mayorga. And I had suggested that he use two different art styles, so that he use a loose style when he's with the cousin, with his friend, and that he use a style with outlines when he's with his brother, so everything is in its place. So he do art styles. This he did himself, and it was just amazing. This is really what makes the book, I think. And I think this is the secret to writing a picture book that's very different than just an illustrated story. That is, you have a double narrative that happens. You have the narrative in the text, and you have the narrative that's taking place in the illustrations. And it's important for the writer to leave enough space for the illustrator to develop and create that additional extra narrative. So, when I'm writing, especially for writing picture books, so picture books are generally between 12 and 15 spreads. So I think of them kind of like writing a sonnet, that you have to write, if there are different ways of writing a sonnet, but usually you have 3 sets of 4 and then a summation, a sort of envoy at the end. So that gives you the 3 arcs and then a little twist at the end. To me, that's a perfect formula for writing a picture book. You could obviously do other types of sonnets. You can have a 6 and an 8. There's lots of ways of doing it. But the important thing is that you have enough action that's going on so that there are illustratable moments. So you can't have just 2 people talking for page after page. That's not dynamic enough to make a picture book. So, and generally, if I'm writing a picture book, I try not to write indications to the artist unless it's the opposite of what the text says. So, I mean, if the artist needs to know, if it says, I'm happy, and, you need to show the character being dejected because it's, the opposite is going on, and then I have to put illustration notes. But otherwise, I leave that up to the artist. There are some times that I've made other suggestions. There was a series of books I did for Spanish publishers, although the editions I have to show are some of the translations. But these were bilingual books that were published, because all of the bilingual books published here in Spain always were Spanish English, and there weren't really books that were, the kids didn't have access to English through Basque directly, through Catalan directly, or through Galician directly. So these were books that I created that were published simultaneously in all 4 languages with English. And so 2 of the stories, one is Just Like Them, and the other is The Boy and the Spy. This is the Hungarian and the Swedish, not the Swedish, the Slovenian translations. In both cases, though, for the whole series, I said, a bilingual book presupposes the multicultural world that we actually live in. And so I said that all of the art had to make sure that it depicted a multicultural world. It could be however the artists wanted to, but that was something that was important. And that was the only sort of, aside from Just Like Them, which had a lot of art direction that's necessary. I can talk through the book in a moment, but otherwise that was just a blanket thing saying, this needs to be how the world is conceived, and then go off and do it however you want to do it. But, it cannot be all able-bodied white people.
How long does it tend to take you? And obviously, sort of, for people who don't know, publishing is quite a long process itself. So there are long lead times. Books can be finished like 8 months before sort of you will see it on a shelf. But how about the writing process? Sort of, how long does a picture book? Because I think it's I mean, you tell me, but I've always think it's a false thing that some adults think that maybe a children's book is a lot easier to write than an adult's book, whereas I'm not convinced that's true.
Things take much more than just 8 months. I mean, 8 months before it's in the bookstores, that's really fast. So, I mean, especially for something that actually needs to be illustrated. I mean, normally, and I think that the English-speaking world goes much, much slower than the Spanish-speaking world. The Spanish-speaking world can do something that fast or even faster, but the English-speaking world also needs a longer lead time where the books are finished and sent to the media, whereas in the Spanish-speaking world, books are sent to the media after they're already printed, and in the English world, they're sent months and months before. So in order for, if a book is coming out in September, the magazines have to get it at least 4 months in advance. The trades, the publications for libraries and bookshops and things like that generally get it 6 months in advance. So you need to have the entire book finished, edited, laid out, and usually they print galleys or what's called F&Gs, folded and gathered, where they have the actual printed books and they're just folded over, but they're not sewn or bound. So books take a long time. Writing them or translating them. So I can use an example. Writing them, I can't say. I spend a lot of time thinking about things. Then the first draft may be very quick, and then you tweak and rewrite, and sometimes you rewrite after it's been illustrated. There's a lot of things that change. But I translated into Spanish this lovely book, Little You, by two First Nations creators that was published by Orca Books, book publishers in Canada. So Richard Van Camp is the author and Julie Flett is the illustrator. So Little You is a book that shows various First Nations families. It's very simple seeming text, very few words, as you can see. And I did the translation into Spanish. So one of the things that happens, the English can be much more gender neutral. Spanish is extremely inflected, which means that nouns have gender, and nouns have gender, whether it's a table is una mesa, which is feminine, but also all sorts of things like professions. It's maestra or maestro, or today to have a gender neutral, people tend to use the E in Spain, maestre, which is the most pronounceable of the direct gender neutral language. There's a lot of other solutions in written form, either Xing out or using an at symbol, which includes the A and the O, but those are not, you can't pronounce them. So the tendency lately has been to use the E as a non-binary solution. So in this book, Little You, the child being addressed, the you is never gendered. And so I did two translations. The first was Spanish uses the masculine as the neutral. And so I did a simple direct translation of the actual text using the masculine as the neutral. That didn't take very long. There's not a lot of words. It took me around 2 weeks, but I made a gender neutral Spanish translation with a lot more liberties with the text, but was much more faithful to the original spirit of the book. So one thing I had to do, I had to change the title. So for one thing, all of the diminutives in Spanish are gendered. So the Spanish title is tú eres tú, you are you. And it rhymes. You can almost see, I think, that the text is slightly longer in Spanish, just the way the language works. It's, and sometimes I had to, the original had thunder, but the thunder wasn't important as the other rhyme word. So I rhymed off the other rhyme word without, so sometimes you would lose, I think it was thunder and wonder. So I kept the wonder and rhymed something off of that. Sometimes I was able to, if it was saying you are perfect, in Spanish, that would be either eres perfecto or eres perfecta. And I changed it to you are perfection, eres la perfección, which is neutral. And so sometimes I was able to make changes like that. Obviously, for a book like this, for this audience, you can't use direct non-binary language like Xing it out, which is something that for an adult text, you could decide to use something like that. This is also something that, translating into English, I think the Anglophone world is much more sensitive to a lot of things than some other countries, and certainly than many Spanish-speaking cultures that I'm translating from. So it might be, we had problems in this book, which was all about a pirate crew, and everyone is named from a country except for Malik el Negro, who was just called the Black Man. And so I said, we cannot have that in English. It's just not going to work. There are already so many gatekeepers looking for excuses to, say no, especially to ooky, scary foreign things, that you can't give them any excuse. And so, there was a recent book that I translated from Chile, and it uses a whole bunch of examples. And one of the examples was Christmas presents. And I flagged it, and I said to the editor, I said, we can make this birthday presents as a way of making it not religious or not religiously specific in a book that's not about religion. It's a book about the brain, actually. And so it was, a neuroscience book, but just, from their point of view, it was just so normal that, in this sort of monoculture that they live in, that they assumed everyone was going to be Christian. The same thing also, that this book is being published in North America. And I said, all of the kids who are named in this book, they're named with Spanish names. I said, we're going to want to mix this up, and have Urvashi and Rashid and mix,
And that's a really tricky decision, because obviously there is I think it's obvious in the cases that you've spoken about, but sometimes it can be hard to know whether to faithfully represent what the original writer and maybe original writer's biases were, sort of obviously in the aim of getting things more diverse published, but then also your I think what you're doing is right, but there is definitely I'm sure some people also disagree with me and think that sort of we shouldn't hide their biases and should then be able to understand what we're reading and then challenge them on that. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, but I think that also there's a difference between cultural specificity that are, I can give two examples of this, I guess, but there are some elements that are culturally, that the books are about a culture, and so you would preserve all of those cultural things. And then there are other things where the casual misogyny or the casual racism is just not relevant, and it's not appropriate, and it's not necessary to repeat it. So in the translation I did of Little You, it took me 2 weeks, it's maybe 80 words, but to get a rhyming version that respected the spirit, because to me it was important to make it in a gender neutral, to not gender the baby, even though the easy thing in Spanish, the typical thing in Spanish would be just to use the masculine. And I was like, the author's very careful never to gender the baby. I know from, I'm a big fan of Richard Van Kamp's adult work as well, and I know that he's included lots of queer characters and things like that. So I said, this is the proper way to treat that. So I translated recently a book. This was the Spanish edition, El Día que Saída Llegó.
Beautiful. That is stunning.
The American edition has a very different cover, The Day Saida Arrived, published by Blue Dot Kids. Now, this is the story of a friendship between two girls, one of which has moved from Morocco. So in the first book, in the original book, she's moved from Morocco to Spain, and all of the cultural references are either Spanish or Moroccan. In the translation, I preserved all of the Moroccan references, especially because the book is all about bilateral language and cultural exchange. So even though one is coming to another country, she's not only learning the words and the culture of the place that she's coming to. So at first her friend thinks that she's lost her words because she doesn't speak yet. And it's not that she's lost them, she just has a different alphabet. And you can sort of see here the Arabic letters. And so they wind up teaching each other words, but also culture. So this is something that, there's one scene where, let's see, where was it?
This feels like a book I'm gonna buy for a child who doesn't exist yet.
Okay.
This one's stunning.
So like on this spread where they're visiting one another's homes, and when they go to the Moroccan girls, to Saida's house, they have couscous in the Spanish version, when they go to the other girl's house, they have, I forget whether it was tortilla or lentils. I forget offhand what it was. I mean, this is one of the problems also that, you know, translating so many books, even though I've translated, I forget details. I forget details of my own books as well. And in the English version, we made it a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And we also changed, so they were reading in the Spanish one, they read poems by Gloria Fuertes, who's a very well-known, she would be like the Michael Rosen for the UK context. And in the English, it's Jacqueline Woodson is the example that we use. So in this case, I localized half the book and I was careful to preserve half the book. But because it, you know, the book is about, you know, the cultural details are relevant in one case and not relevant in the other, if that makes sense. Yeah. The other example about this issue that I was going to mention, a friend of mine, Mohini Gupta, is a translator between English and Hindi primarily, although she's also translates Welsh. She's, I think, the only Welsh Hindi translator.
Oh gosh, I'll have to investigate. I'll have to have her on. Perfect. Yeah.
So she translated into Hindi Vikram Seth's Beastly Tales, which is a children's rhyming poetry collection. Now, Vikram Seth is an Indian writer writing in a colonial language, English, and he has so much wordplay. And so, you know, one of the poems, for instance, is an acrostic, and it's either his brother-in-law or sister-in-law, I forget offhand who it was. And so in the translation, Mohini she recreated the acrostic with rhymes. The only thing is that she had to leave out maybe half of the stuff because phonetically it took up half as many lines. So she had to, she still has it with an acrostic in Hindi and it rhymes in Hindi as couplets, but she couldn't keep all of the content because there just wasn't space. But the most interesting thing, and this is the sort of point that I wanted to make, is that at one point he uses, for instance, the BBC, he calls it the Beastly Broadcasting Company. So he makes all of these animal puns using British colonialist tropes. So in the translation, Mohini she made new puns, animal puns, but with Indian broadcasting companies, and so, or radio stations. And so she localized it because of the politics involved of what English means and what British colonial references mean in an Indian context. Whereas if she was translating from Hindi into English, she would have preserved all of those details because those details would be culturally important and relevant, and you wouldn't want to whitewash them or erase them. So, you know, these are questions that we have to always weigh. Those of us who are trying to be ethical, responsible, and
moral, maybe.
Which not everyone is. I mean, you know, and this is sort of, it's obviously I will make mistakes. Obviously, I have blind spots, and so there are things that I take for granted, and I just assume that this is this when it may be something else. When there's nuances, and you know, this is why cultural details are so tricky and so important for us as translators to look up, to investigate, to and there's also the question of things, hybridity. You know, for instance, you could have Welsh English in the same book in a way, and then how do you translate something like that? You know, this happens a lot when I'm translating Spanglish. So if I'm translating something, I then leave in other words you know, if there were already words in English in the Spanglish, I would then leave other words in Spanish to recreate that same texture, that hybrid texture, which is important to maintain, I think.
There is absolutely bucketfuls of advice from everything you said in this talk for young translators, you know, lots of debates and thoughts to hopefully get them thinking. But, you know, for our young audience out there, do you have any advice if they were looking to get into translation, especially Spanish, given that sort of, you know, as a sort of Anglophone audience, Spanish is quite accessible for younger kids to sort of get into. It's more likely to be taught in schools, is kind of what I'm trying to say.
Okay, I wasn't sure that's the case in the UK. Certainly it is the case in the US, I think. But I recently did an event for the Scottish Book Trust, and one of the things I did was I created a resource for them about translation for younger readers. And so that's something that if they want to go to the Scottish Book Trust website and look for it, it is not language specific. So there's, I think, 4 or 5 different exercises. And in one I did take a Mexican poem for kids that I had translated, The Language of Ghosts, and I substituted words for emojis. And so I have the Spanish and then the emoji version in English. And then I asked them to match, to look up the vocabulary of what the emojis mean, what words in Spanish are the emojis. So that's an early way of doing it, of, just identifying word by word. And then there's a lot of talk about English to English translation of idioms, how to say an idiom another way. And so, there are things that are possibly confusing, like a lot of feeling and emotion idioms, tickled pink or under the weather in English. How would you say that in a way to explain them to someone who doesn't know English? And so those are translation exercises that kids can do. I would also encourage that for all of our young listeners, that the Stephen Spender Prize, the Stephen Spender has lots of resources as well, but they also have a prize with with 2 specific categories for under 18 and I think under 13. I don't know the exact age cutoff, but the Stephen Spender Trust has a lot of information in that regard. There's also a website called World Kidlit, and World Kidlit also has a resource page that has a lot of information about getting into translation and translated kids books and kids books that aren't yet translated but should be, and all sorts of stuff like that. So
yeah, they're a really fabulous team behind World Kidlit as well. Very much. Well, Lawrence, I can't thank you enough for this talk. Is there anything we've missed or that you really wanted to touch on before we wrap up?
I mean, we've covered quite a lot, so I think I'll say diolch for inviting me and discussing all of these questions. And I mean, obviously this is something that I love and think about all the time. This is my day-to-day, whether I'm creating books or translating books. And I mean, one of the things for me is that there's a certain level of, sometimes publishers will come to me and ask me to translate things, but a lot of stuff is that or one of the things I most love about translation, I'm a reader, as you can sort of see behind me. This is just the poetry section right there, but I'm reading constantly and in multiple languages. So that's Spanish and this is English. And so when I fall in love with something and I want to share it with more people, translation is sort of one of the ways that I get to do that. And so, very often I'm beating on publishers' doors, not just for my own work, but to say, I read this great book, take a look at it, and, do you agree with me? So
maybe that's the most useful advice as well, just read. I don't think that advice can ever be replaced.
And it's important, I think, to read in not just in the source language, but also in your target language, so that you have familiarity with vocabulary and things like that. So, yeah.
And essentially, I don't know if somebody's not been exposed to university courses or things like that, like all those are reading courses, that all of them are about reading, and sort of actually like that's how we all learn when it comes down to it, although it does help to sometimes have exams to make you work.
But I mean, I think this is also the thing that, and I sort of mentioned it earlier, that one of the things I love about writing for younger readers is that if you give them a good story and you don't talk down to them, that they love it. And for me, I'm delighted when parents complain that their kids ask for the same book every night. To say that there's nothing that could be better for an author or someone who's translated a book than to have that sort of connection. And so, and also I think that, just to mention that I don't think that kids or young readers or older people should be afraid of translation. And you can love translation. You can, you have the right to translate whatever you want for yourself or to share with someone else. You can't, publishing is a very different thing. For publishing, you have to have the rights and all sorts of things like that. But I think that we live in a very globalized and very multicultural society in lots of places. So, I mean, very often people may have multiple languages in their life as they're growing up, and they are already translating in their daily life, in their domestic life. I mean, in Wales, you have a multilingual culture. There's just been Brexit, so the UK is leaving the EU, but even just food these days, when you buy anything in the EU, it usually has the ingredients in all of these other languages. And so we're constantly exposed to multiple languages. And even just speaking in English has so many roots from Latin, Greek, and German particularly, but also lots of other words that it's just sort of stolen from. Well, we don't have to say that, we'll just take that word. So, we're constantly translating. If we're not translating, we're using many other languages as part of our daily speech. So, fall in love with language, use language however you want to use language. Language is about communication, so even if you haven't studied a language or you haven't studied a course, that doesn't mean you can't write or translate or express yourself the way that you want to. So, and it can also be that you don't have to have this discrete everything in one language and then translate it into another. Things, our lives are very mixed.
Absolutely. And it's best they be that way. It makes all our lives richer for it. Thank you so much, Lawrence. I can't thank you enough for taking the time out. And thank you for everyone for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed today's talk, and check out the rest of our programme, especially if you are interested in the rest of our children's talks. And there is one for every day of the festival. So I hope you enjoy them. And thanks for watching. Bye.
Hasta luego.